Vladimir Putin has just issued a threat so serious, so specific, and so genuinely terrifying that it has sent the entire British government into absolute panic mode and triggered emergency sessions of Parliament that are happening behind closed doors right now as you watch this. This isn't the usual geopolitical posturing or diplomatic sabre rattling that the media loves to hype up for clicks. This is a credible and imminent threat to British national security that has intelligence agencies working around the clock and military officials implementing contingency plans that haven't been activated since the height of the Cold War. Sources inside the Ministry of Defence and Intelligence Services are describing a level of alarm and urgency that they've never witnessed in their entire careers, with senior officials using language like existential threat and unprecedented danger when discussing Putin's warning in classified briefings. The public has been told almost nothing about what's actually happening because the government is terrified of causing mass panic, but the signs are everywhere if you know where to look. Military movements that can't be explained, emergency meetings at the highest levels of government, sudden changes to security protocols at critical infrastructure sites, and a complete communications blackout on certain topics that would normally be discussed openly. Putin's warning didn't come through normal diplomatic channels or public statements. It was delivered through back-channel intelligence communications that are reserved for the most serious threats, the kind of messages that nations only send when they're absolutely serious about following through. And what Putin has threatened to do unless Britain changes course on certain policies, it's so catastrophic that government officials who've been briefed on it are reportedly unable to sleep at night, knowing what could happen if this crisis isn't resolved. The crisis began escalating several days ago when British intelligence agencies intercepted communications indicating that Russia was preparing some kind of significant operation targeting UK interests. But the initial intelligence was fragmentary and didn't reveal the full scope of what Putin was planning. What we now know from sources with access to classified briefings is that Russia has identified critical vulnerabilities in British infrastructure, financial systems and supply chains that could be exploited to cause massive disruption and potentially catastrophic consequences for millions of ordinary citizens. Putin's warning, delivered through intelligence channels to the highest levels of British government, made it absolutely clear that Russia has the capability and the willingness to strike these vulnerable points unless Britain reverses its policies on several key issues, particularly its support for Ukraine and its involvement in NATO operations that Russia views as direct threats to its security interests. The specific nature of the threats is deeply classified, but sources describe scenarios involving cyber attacks on power grids that could leave entire regions without electricity for weeks, disruption of food and fuel supply chains that could cause shortages and civil unrest, and potential targeting of financial infrastructure that could trigger economic chaos and undermine confidence in British banks and currency. What makes Putin's warning so credible and so terrifying is that Russian intelligence and military capabilities in these areas are far more advanced than most people realise, and there's extensive evidence that Moscow has been preparing for exactly this kind of escalation for years. British intelligence has tracked Russian reconnaissance of critical infrastructure, mapping of supply chain vulnerabilities, and pre-positioning of cyber weapons that could be activated with minimal warning to cause maximum damage. The Russians have demonstrated their willingness to use these capabilities in the past, with attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure serving as proof of concept for what they could do to any nation they viewed as an enemy or threat. What's different about the current situation is the directness and specificity of Putin's threat, leaving no doubt that this isn't just contingency planning, but an actual ultimatum with concrete deadlines and consequences if Britain doesn't comply with Russian demands. Government officials who've been briefed describe feeling physically sick when they understood the full implications of what Putin was threatening and the limited options available for responding effectively without either capitulating to Russian blackmail or risking catastrophic consequences for British citizens. The emergency parliamentary sessions that have been convened to address this crisis are happening under conditions of extreme secrecy, with even most MPS excluded from the full briefings and only a small inner circle of senior ministers, intelligence chiefs and military commanders having access to the complete picture of what Britain is facing. The sessions that have been publicly announced are covering vague topics like national security preparedness and critical infrastructure resilience, carefully worded to avoid revealing the specific nature of the Russian threat, while still allowing the government to take emergency measures that would normally require extensive parliamentary debate. Behind the scenes, the real discussions are about impossible choices between maintaining Britain's support for Ukraine and its NATO commitments versus protecting British citizens from Russian retaliation that could cause suffering on a massive scale. There's intense debate about whether Putin is actually serious about following through on his threats, or whether this is a bluff designed to divide the Western alliance and force Britain to abandon Ukraine at a critical moment in the conflict. Intelligence assessments are apparently divided on this question, with some analysts believing Putin is desperate enough to escalate dramatically, while others argue that Russia lacks the capability to carry out the most extreme scenarios and is hoping Britain will capitulate based on fear rather than actual demonstrated capability. The military dimension of the crisis is equally alarming, with sources describing quiet but significant changes to the readiness posture of British armed forces and coordination with NATO allies to prepare for potential Russian escalation that could extend beyond just cyber and economic warfare. There are reports of increased submarine activity in the North Atlantic, unusual Russian naval movements near British territorial waters, and what intelligence officials describe as probing actions designed to test British detection capabilities and response times. Putin's warning apparently included veiled references to Russia's nuclear capabilities and willingness to use tactical nuclear weapons in certain scenarios. Language that has sent chills through the defence establishment and triggered activation of protocols for protecting government continuity and essential services in the event of nuclear attack. While most experts believe the nuclear threat is likely posturing rather than genuine intent, the fact that Putin is willing to reference it at all indicates a level of escalation and risk-taking that has fundamentally changed calculations about how far Russia might be willing to go to achieve its objectives. British military planners are reportedly working through scenarios that seemed unthinkable just weeks ago, trying to prepare for contingencies that the nation hasn't seriously contemplated since the darkest days of the Cold War. The public has been kept almost entirely in the dark about the true severity of this crisis, with the government making a calculated decision that revealing the full extent of Putin's threats would cause panic and potentially play into Russian hands by demonstrating the effectiveness of their intimidation tactics. But this information blackout is creating its own problems, with rumours and speculation filling the void left by official silence and some MPS who've been partially briefed, expressing frustration that they can't properly represent their constituents when they don't know what dangers those constituents actually face. There have been carefully orchestrated leaks to friendly media outlets designed to prepare public opinion for potential policy changes or emergency measures without revealing the specific threats that are driving those decisions. Stories about the need for improved cyber security, the importance of energy independence, and the value of maintaining strategic food and fuel reserves have all appeared in recent days, part of a coordinated effort to condition the public for potential disruptions while maintaining plausible deniability about the immediate Russian threat. Government ministers have been instructed to avoid any language that could be interpreted as backing down to Russian pressure, while also being told to prepare the ground for potential policy adjustments that might be necessary to de-escalate the crisis. The economic implications of this crisis are potentially staggering and are already being felt in ways that most people don't recognise or connect to the Russian threat. Financial markets have been experiencing unusual volatility, with sharp movements in currency and commodity prices that don't align with normal economic indicators. Insiders attribute this to major institutional investors who've been quietly briefed about potential Russian action and are repositioning their portfolios to protect against the scenarios that intelligence agencies consider most likely. The Bank of England has apparently activated emergency protocols for maintaining financial stability in the event of major disruptions to payment systems or banking infrastructure, measures that are normally reserved for severe financial crises or wartime conditions. Energy companies have been instructed to maximise storage capacity and prepare for potential disruptions to supply, with government officials quietly ensuring that strategic reserves are at maximum levels without publicly acknowledging why this sudden urgency exists. Food retailers and logistic companies have received confidential guidance about maintaining supply chain resilience, again without public explanation of the specific threats driving this heightened state of preparedness. The diplomatic dimension of the crisis has been equally intense, with frantic behind-the-scenes consultations between London, Washington and other NATO capitals about how to respond to Putin's ultimatum in ways that demonstrate allied unity while also avoiding catastrophic escalation. The Americans are apparently pushing for a hard line that refuses to make any concessions to Russian blackmail, arguing that giving in to Putin's threats would only invite further escalation and demonstrate that intimidation works. But British officials are reportedly more cautious, acutely aware that it's British citizens who would suffer the immediate consequences if Russia follows through on its threats, and that American pledges of solidarity might not translate into meaningful protection against cyber attacks or infrastructure disruption. European allies are similarly divided, with some countries urging accommodation to avoid escalation, while others insist that Putin's threats are a bluff and that showing weakness would be strategically catastrophic. These diplomatic tensions are playing out in emergency NATO meetings where officials are trying to present a united front while actually deeply divided about the appropriate response to a threat that has no clear historical precedent or established playbook for resolution. The intelligence community's efforts to understand Putin's decision-making and anticipate his next moves have intensified dramatically, with every available resource being directed toward penetrating Russian leadership circles and gaining insight into whether Putin is genuinely prepared to follow through on his threats or is engaged in an elaborate game of brinkmanship. Analysts are poring over every public statement and private communication from Russian officials, looking for signs of whether Moscow is preparing for actual escalation or simply trying to maximize psychological pressure without real intent to act. The problem is that Putin's decision-making has become increasingly unpredictable and isolated, with even his closest advisors as apparently uncertain about his true intentions or ability to accurately assess risks and consequences. There are disturbing reports from intelligence sources suggesting that Putin may be operating in an information bubble where he's fed exaggerated assessments of Russian capabilities and underestimates of Western resolve, a dangerous combination that could lead to catastrophic miscalculations. The psychological profile work being done on Putin suggests a leader who feels cornered and desperate, who views the Ukraine conflict as existential for Russia and himself personally, and who may be willing to take enormous risks that a more rational actor would reject as too dangerous. The contingency planning happening across British government and society is revealing just how unprepared the nation actually is for the kind of hybrid warfare that Putin is threatening to unleash. Decades of peace and prosperity have left infrastructure vulnerable, supply chains optimised for efficiency rather than resilience, and population largely ignorant of basic civil defence measures that were common knowledge during the Cold War. Emergency planners are scrambling to update protocols and procedures that haven't been seriously reviewed since the 1980s, discovering in the process that many of the assumptions underlying those old plans are no longer valid in a world of interconnected systems and just-in-time logistics. The realisation that Britain could face serious disruptions to electricity, food, water or financial services has triggered urgent efforts to identify and protect the most critical systems. but officials acknowledge privately that the vulnerabilities are so extensive and the potential attack vectors so numerous that comprehensive protection is probably impossible with the resources and time available. The focus has shifted to ensuring continuity of essential services and protecting the most vulnerable populations, while accepting that significant disruption may be unavoidable if Russia decides to follow through on its threats. The political consequences of this crisis for Keir Starmer's already embattled government could be terminal, with the Prime Minister facing impossible choices where every option carries enormous risks and potential for catastrophic outcomes. If he maintains current policies and Russia follows through on its threats, causing widespread suffering for British citizens, he'll be blamed for recklessly prioritising foreign policy objectives over the safety and well-being of people at home. But if he backs down and accommodates Russian demands, he'll be accused of cowardice and betraying Ukraine and Western allies in the face of bullying and intimidation. The opposition is already preparing to weaponise this crisis regardless of which path Starmer chooses, with some arguing he's been too provocative toward Russia, while others will claim he's shown weakness in the face of threats. Behind the scenes, there are reports of intense arguments within the government about the appropriate response, with some ministers urging de-escalation and others insisting that giving in to Putin's blackmail would be morally wrong and strategically disastrous. The stress of managing this crisis, while also dealing with all the other scandals and challenges facing the government, has reportedly left Starmer looking exhausted and overwhelmed, with close associates expressing concern about his ability to make clear decisions under this kind of pressure. The long-term implications of this crisis extend far beyond immediate questions of how to respond to Putin's specific threats and touch on fundamental issues about Britain's role in the world and its ability to defend itself in an era of hybrid warfare and unconventional threats. The stark reality is that Britain has allowed itself to become vulnerable in ways that make it susceptible to exactly the kind of pressure Putin is now applying, with critical infrastructure dependent on international supply chains and digital systems that can be disrupted by sophisticated adversaries. The recognition of these vulnerabilities is forcing painful conversations about the costs and trade-offs involved in becoming more resilient and self-sufficient. Investments that will require enormous resources and potentially force Britain to accept lower efficiency and higher costs in exchange for greater security. There are also difficult questions about whether Britain can afford to maintain its current international commitments and global role when those commitments make the country a target for adversaries who can strike in ways that traditional military power doesn't effectively deter or defend against. Looking ahead, the resolution of this immediate crisis with Russia will not solve the underlying problem that the world has entered a new era of great power competition where traditional rules and norms no longer provide reliable guardrails against escalation and catastrophic conflict. Putin's willingness to threaten Britain with measures that could cause mass civilian suffering represents a fundamental rejection of the post-Cold War security architecture and a return to a more dangerous world where might makes right and intimidation is a legitimate tool of statecraft. Britain and its allies will need to fundamentally rethink their strategies and capabilities for this new reality, investing in resilience and defensive capabilities that can protect against hybrid threats, while also maintaining credible deterrence that makes adversaries think twice about escalation. The crisis that's unfolding right now is a wake-up call that Britain can no longer take security and stability for granted, that the comfortable assumptions of the past few decades no longer hold, and that difficult choices and sacrifices will be necessary to navigate the dangerous period ahead. The British people deserve to know the truth about what their nation faces and what will be required to meet these challenges. But whether the political class has the courage and honesty to have that conversation remains very much an open question. The intelligence assessments that have been shared with the Prime Minister and his inner circle paint an even more disturbing picture of Russia's preparation and intent than what has been revealed to the broader security establishment. According to sources with direct access to these classified briefings, Russian operatives have already infiltrated key positions within British infrastructure companies logistics networks, and even government contractor organisations, positioning themselves to cause maximum disruption when given the order to act. These aren't just cyber warriors sitting in Moscow waiting to launch digital attacks, but actual human assets embedded within British society who have spent years building cover identities and gaining access to sensitive systems. The counterintelligence implications are staggering, suggesting that Britain's security services have been penetrated far more extensively than previously acknowledged, and that Russia has been planning this kind of escalation for much longer than anyone realised. MI5 and MI6 are reportedly conducting emergency sweeps of personnel with access to critical systems, but officials acknowledge that the scope of potential Russian infiltration is so vast that they're likely only catching a fraction of the actual operatives in place. The specific targets that Putin has threatened to hit are reportedly chosen for maximum psychological impact and disruption to daily life rather than direct military value, a deliberate strategy to turn the British public against their government's Ukraine policy by making ordinary citizens bear the costs of continued support for Kyiv. Intelligence indicates that Russia has mapped out scenarios for cascading failures where attacks on one system trigger breakdowns in connected systems, amplifying the damage and making recovery exponentially more difficult. For instance, cyber attacks on energy distribution could be timed to coincide with physical sabotage of backup systems and disinformation campaigns designed to spread panic and prevent effective emergency response. The nightmare scenario that keeps security officials awake at night involves coordinated strikes across multiple sectors simultaneously, overwhelming Britain's ability to respond effectively and creating genuine chaos that could take weeks or months to fully resolve. Putin apparently believes that British public opinion would turn rapidly against continued Ukraine support if people experienced even a few days without power, empty supermarket shelves or frozen bank accounts, and he may well be right about the fragility of public resolve when confronted with genuine hardship at home. The divisions within NATO about how to respond to Putin's ultimatum are becoming increasingly public, despite efforts to maintain a facade of unity, with some member states quietly suggesting that Britain should consider accommodation to avoid triggering a crisis that could spiral into broader conflict. The Baltic states and Poland are taking the hardest line, arguing from their own experience with Russian aggression that any concession to Putin's threats will only invite further escalation, and that the only language Moscow understands is strength and resolve. But France and Germany are reportedly more ambivalent, with officials in Paris and Berlin quietly expressing concern that British policy has been unnecessarily provocative and that some adjustment might be prudent to reduce tensions. These divisions are exactly what Putin is counting on, the hope that pressure on Britain will fracture Western unity and create space for Russia to achieve its objectives in Ukraine without facing a truly unified response. American officials are trying to hold the alliance together while dealing with their own domestic political divisions about continued support for Ukraine, creating a complex diplomatic environment where Britain cannot simply rely on automatic allied backing for whatever course of action Starmer chooses.